So on my channel, I'm closing in on 200,000 subscribers, which means that I'm getting my video ready to answer 200 questions from my subscribers. One of the questions that I received over and over again is which team was the greatest basketball team of all time if every player on the roster was in their prime. Seeing that this was a really fun question and that I really needed time to flesh out my thoughts, I figured I'd give this one its own individual video. So these are the top 16 teams in NBA history, in my opinion, if all the players involved were in their prime. The reason I picked 16 is pretty simple, because at some point I might like to run a playoff simulation in NBA 2K. Let me know and me and my editor will get it ready. Starting off with number 16, the 06 to 07 Miami Heat. The hypothetical starting lineup would be Gary Payton, who was a Defensive Player of the Year winner and a 20 points per game scorer in his prime. You have Dwayne Wade, who was a great defensive player as well and a 30 points per game scorer. You had Eddie Jones, who was a perennial all-star, Antoine Walker, who was a great three-point shooter and a scorer in his own right, and you have a prime Shaquille O'Neal, who was the most dominant player in modern NBA history. Some of the noteworthy players who would be coming off the bench would be Alonzo Mourning, who was an elite two-way player in his own right, and Jason Williams, who was a solid playmaker and a highlight machine. Number 15, the 2021 to 2022 Los Angeles Lakers. It's hard to say whether or not these guys would have on-court chemistry if they all were in their primes, but without question, they would be incredibly talented. You have Russell Westbrook in his triple-double 30 points per game form. You have Carmelo Anthony, probably from his days as a Denver Nugget. You have LeBron James, who is going to be in his impressive 2013 Miami form. Then there's Anthony Davis and Dwight Howard, which will make them one of the greatest interior defenses of all time. That's just the starting unit. Coming off the bench would be a prime Rajon Rondo, Isaiah Thomas, DeAndre Jordan, and Trevor Ariza. Number 14, the 98 to 99 Los Angeles Lakers. The starting lineup would be Derek Fisher, Kobe Bryant, Glenn Rice, Dennis Rodman, and Shaquille O'Neal. Some of the more noteworthy players to come off the bench would be one of the most clutch shooters of all time, Robert Horry, Eddie Jones, and Eldon Campbell. Number 13, the 1979 to 1980 Boston Celtics. The starting lineup would be Nate Tiny Archibald, Pistol Pete Maravich, Cedric Cornbread Maxwell, Larry Bird, and Dave Cowens. 4 of these guys were either MVP winners or MVP finalists. The only guy who wasn't was Cedric Maxwell, but he was also a Finals MVP winner. One of the more noteworthy players to come off the bench would be ML Carr. Number 12, the 2012 to 2013 Los Angeles Lakers. At that point in time, Steve Nash was nowhere close to his prime, as he was approaching the age of 40 and was having plenty of back problems. But this time, he'd be the floor general in his peak form. Alongside of him would be a peak Kobe Bryant, Ron Artest in his Defensive Player of the Year form in Indiana, and Dwight Howard, who would be just as good as he was in Orlando well before the back surgery. One of the more noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Antawn Jamison, who was one of the best scorers in the league during the early 2000s. Number 11, the 1985 to 1986 Boston Celtics. The starting lineup would be Danny Ainge, Dennis Johnson, Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and instead of Robert Parrish, it would be a prime Bill Walton. It's also worth considering that Dennis Johnson gets a significant boost as he would be in his Finals MVP form from his Seattle Supersonics days. Robert Parrish is obviously the one coming off the bench, as he was a great defensive player and a 20 points per game scorer. Number 10, the 17 to 18 Cleveland Cavaliers. Starting at point guard would be Derrick Rose, who would be in his young MVP form. Then you have Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, and Kevin Love. And people forget that Love was one of the league's top scorers and the game's top rebounder while he was in Minnesota. Tristan Thompson finishes out the starting 5. Some of the noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Kyle Korver and J.R. Smith. Number 9. The 1971-1972 Los Angeles Lakers. This is the team that famously won an NBA record 33 straight regular season games, and won 69 games in total before they went on to win the NBA championship. With that being said, most of the players involved were not in their prime. Jerry West was as good as ever, and so was Gil Goodrich. But at the 3 spot, this was the final season of Elgin Baylor's career, and he didn't even make it through the first half of the regular season. Then you have Happy Hairston, and now a prime Wilt Chamberlain, who was in his 1962 50 points and 25 rebounds per game form. One of the noteworthy players to come off the bench was Jim McMillan. Number 8. The 2012-2013 Miami Heat. The starting 5 would be Mario Chalmers, Dwayne Wade, Ray Allen, LeBron James, and Chris Bosh. You gotta remember, this team won 27 straight regular season games, but guys like Bosh and Wade had already taken a significant step back. The only guy that was actually in his prime was LeBron James. But now, you're getting a Ray Allen who was capable of averaging 25 points per game, and who was even an above-the-rim player. Without question, Ray Allen being in his peak form is the greatest upgrade for this squad. Some of the noteworthy players to come off the bench would be a peak Rashard Lewis, who was a great scorer and an all-time great three-point shooter, Shane Battier, who was a fantastic defensive player, and Mike Miller, who was a solid three-point shooter. Number 7. The 2012-2013 San Antonio Spurs. You would have Tony Parker in his finals MVP form, and then you would have a peak Tracy McGrady, who would be just as good as he was in Orlando in the early 2000s. Then you have Kawhi Leonard, who would be in his 2019 Toronto Raptors form, Boris Diaw at the power forward, and Tim Duncan at the 5. Some of the more noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Manu Ginobili, Danny Green, and a 20 points per game scorer in Steven Jackson. Number 6. The 1985-1986 Philadelphia 76ers. One of the best playmakers and pickpockets of the era was Maurice Cheeks, and alongside of him would be a fantastic scorer in Andrew Toney. That small forward would be Julius Erving. The power forward would be an MVP form Charles Barkley, and the starting center is one of the most underrated players of all time, the 30 points and 15 rebounds per game Moses Malone. Coming off the bench would be one of the greatest scorers in NBA history, who averaged as high as 34 points per game in the 1970s, and his name is Bob McAdoo, who was also an MVP winner. Another bench player would be the Secretary of Defense Bobby Jones, who was simply one of the greatest defensive players of all time. Number 5. The 1984-1985 Los Angeles Lakers. Now picture the Showtime Lakers in all of their glory, but instead of just Kareem Abdul-Jabbar being in his usual Showtime form, he is even better, as he is as good as he was on the Milwaukee Bucks in the early 1970s. The starting 5 would be Magic Johnson, Byron Scott, James Worthy, Bob McAdoo in his 34 points per game form, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Coming off the bench would be an NBA Hall of Famer Jamal Wilkes, and one of the greatest role players and 3-and-D players of all time, Michael Cooper. Number 4. The 2010-2011 Boston Celtics. Obviously, they would have all the great attributes that they had of the team that won the championship in 2008. But Paul Pierce is better because now he's in his early 2000s prime form. Kevin Garnett is in his Minnesota Timberwolves 2004 MVP form. Ray Allen is much better as he's in his 25 points per game form. And even Rajon Rondo is now in his 2012 form instead of 2008. This team instantly becomes so much better. And oh yeah, starting at the center is now the most dominant player in modern history, Shaquille O'Neal. Coming off the bench would be one of the guys who was one of the best bigs in the Eastern Conference for a short period of time, and that's Jermaine O'Neal. Number 3. the 2003 to 2004 Los Angeles Lakers. This is a team that went all the way to the NBA Finals in 2004, but consider the fact that none of these guys were in their prime. Gary Payton was in the twilight of his career, and was nowhere close to his 1996 form where he was the Defensive Player of the Year. Kobe Bryant wasn't himself as he was dealing with the Colorado trials. Then there's Rick Fox as small forward. Starting at power forward would be Karl Malone, but this time in his peak form from the 1990s, and Shaquille O'Neal, who would be in his peak shape from the 99 to 2000 season. Some of the noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Derek Fisher and a prime Horace Grant, who would be just as good as he was in the early 90s with the Chicago Bulls. Number 2, the 2018 to 2019 Golden State Warriors. The starting lineup would be Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, Draymond Green, and DeMarcus Cousins. Essentially, you have the 2017 Golden State Warriors, but instead of Zaza Pachulia in the 5 spot, you have a prime DeMarcus Cousins, who was a great scorer, a solid rebounder, and one of the best passing bigs at his peak. A couple noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Andre Iguodala, and this was a much better Iggy, as he would be in his extremely athletic Philadelphia 76ers form. And the other noteworthy bench player is a prime Andrew Bogut. Number 1, the 96 to 97 Chicago Bulls. Now picture all of the glory of the 95 to 96 Bulls, who won an NBA record at the time 72 games, on their way to the NBA championship. To this day, that's the most regular season games won by a team that won the championship. But what's crazy is that none of those players were in their prime. Think about it. Even Michael Jordan was much better in his first three-peat, both athletically and statistically. Scottie Pippen had his career year 2 years prior. Dennis Rodman was much younger, much more athletic, and had better rebounding numbers in the early 90s. And even Ron Harper, who would be the starting point guard, wasn't in the same form that he once was with the Clippers and the Cleveland Cavaliers, where he was an athletic player who was a 20 points per game scorer. But instead of Luke Longley, starting at the 5 would be Robert Parrish, an all-time great big, a solid defensive player, and a 20 points per game scorer. Then coming off the bench, you'd have Tony Kukoc and Steve Kerr. This team would have everything. They'd have the scoring, they'd have the defense, both on the interior and on the perimeter. They had rebounding, they had chemistry, and not only did they have the greatest player of all time, but likely the greatest coach of all time as well. And that's why this incredibly upgraded version of the 90s Bulls is my choice as the greatest team of all time in this ridiculously hypothetical scenario. So what do you guys think? Do you agree with the list? I gotta be honest, I changed my mind about 15 times while I was making this list. So if yours is different than mine, I won't hold it against you, but I'd like to hear about it in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.